Hello, so I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about my leadership perspective, my point of view. When I first started to think about this problem, I possibly got a little bit bogged down in detail of what my strategy is, my personality type, what I would like to be perceived of as a leader by the people, and how I'd like people to interact with me, how I'd like them to behave if I was leading them. And whilst that is important, I think actually it was possibly missing some of the bigger picture stuff about leadership and what my overall perspective on leadership is. So I know, for example, I'm a collaborative sort of leader. I like to build consensus. I like people to feel that they're engaged, and I will very happily leave people who are experts, who know more about the thing than I do, to just get on and do the job, and to give them that sort of freedom and space. And there are risks associated with that sort of leadership style, which I appreciate, and so I would imagine that I would like to adapt to my leadership style depending on the context, which in a way got me thinking about the bigger picture stuff. So perspectives change depending on time and space. As an example, if I look out the window behind me, I'll see a tree in the front lawn, and if I look at it from this perspective, I will see a trunk, some roots, and a few of the lower branches. If my perspective never changed, that's all I'd think a tree was. I would miss out on 50% of the tree or more. But if I went upstairs and looked at it, I would see mostly canopy. I wouldn't really see very much of the trunk or the roots. And again, if that was the only perspective I had on the tree, then I'd have, again, a warped perspective of what a tree was. So that's why context is important in terms of space, but also in terms of time. So if I look at my back window now, out the kitchen window, I'll see some roses in the back garden in little pots, and if you looked at them in midwinter, they wouldn't be particularly exciting. They would be sort of slightly shrubby looking thorny plants, and you might wonder, if that's all you saw, why on earth would you have these little things in pots? But if you look at them now, they're in full bloom. They look quite spectacular, and again, your perspective changes in time, and I think leadership is like that. I think if you walk into any coffee room anywhere in the world, you'll find a doctor moaning about something, and quite often they are moaning about leadership and management type of problems. They're quite often not moaning about clinical things. Whether they know that or not is a different matter, but their perspective on leadership is very different to my perspective on leadership, because they're looking at it from their place and time, whereas I would be looking at it from a completely different. I would like to imagine that I would look at things from more the canopy approach, the helicopter view. But I also think that leadership is potentially easy to do when it's easy, but much harder to do when it's hard. That sounds like a very trite thing to say, but what I mean is the NHS lurches from black escalation to black escalation. This is my trust is. We're in winter pressures in the middle of June, which is practically unheard of. But it's harder to get away with being a mediocre leader when we're in a crisis mode. Likewise, it's harder to build up those team rapports, and I personally struggle in this sort of environment because I like to build up the rapport, build those relationships, build those partnerships, and you quite often don't have time in the crisis mode, and so you need to change your leadership style depending on that context. I also think that ultimately leadership is about people. It's a transaction, a social transaction. So I agree to be led, and I agree to let you lead me. But that comes with some implicit and explicit assumptions along the way. So you must behave how I think a leader behaves, and I'll agree to behave as a follower behaves. And that's one of those natural things that we all learn at school. But those relationships can break down very easily, and it sometimes can be very hard to mend them again. I also think that leadership is about delivery, and whilst that's potentially easy to think about if you're the chief operating officer of Google and you have X number of profits you need to make, or shares that shareholders you need to keep happy, in the NHS it's slightly harder to see that sort of transactional nature, but it's still there. We have things to deliver, we need to get patients through the system, we need targets to meet, and ultimately we need to develop the people in our teams, because we're not going to be around forever, and leadership succession planning is something that NHS has historically been very poor at, but it's actually possibly one of the main functions of a leader, is to bring along the next generation. So that's my leadership perspective, and hopefully no one's mowing the lawn again, so it's about the sixth time I've had to record this.